Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Hamilton, and during my working hours, I am the Director of the Forum on Global Violence Prevention and the Director of the Forum on Public-Private Partnerships for Global Health and Safety at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I am also a part of the nonprofit Parallel Networks and its Center for the Study of Trauma and Radicalization. I speak today as part of this truly amazing organization, which offers a transdisciplinary, network theory-informed, holistic framework for preventing and countering violent extremism. This organization disseminates knowledge regarding the interrelationships between polarization, structural injustice, racism, radicalization, and extremism to the public, practitioners, and policymakers. I was also given the honor of moderating this discussion. Today, we will hear from Jesse Morton, who is a former jihadist recruiter that left the movement and has gone on to found and direct Parallel Networks. We will also hear from Darrell Davis, a world-renowned African-American musician and author who attends KKK and far-right rallies and has pulled over 200 extremists away from a range of movements. After that, we will hear from Lurie, who once led an offshoot of the National Socialist Movement, the largest neo-Nazi organization in Michigan. He left that movement and works to promote peace and raise awareness of the impact of recent socio-political events and the threats posed by the far right. He's also a prevention interventionist with Parallel Networks. After that, we will hear from Hope Hyder, who is an interventionist at Parallel Networks. Hope's father, who was set to be a Kansas City star on the jazz scene, was murdered by a white supremacist. Finally, we will hear from Michael Brown, who is the Associate Director for Field Operations at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. Parallel Networks is a recipient of the DHS Targeted Violence and Terrorism Grant Program, launched late this year. Michael helps localities establish and expand local intervention frameworks and prevent individuals from radicalizing to violence through technical, financial, and educational assistance. However, Michael himself has also been deeply and personally impacted by violent extremism, and I will let him tell his story. Before we begin, I want to speak for a moment about why we so desperately need to hear from survivors of extremism, those working to combat extremism, and those former extremists that can help us to understand the trauma and psychologies this population has, so that we can find a way to de-radicalize them. Essentially, America today is becoming increasingly more polarized, and through this we see the emergence of the far right, white supremacists, and also the far left. Where does this intensification of polarization come from? Well, writers like Ezra Klein have noted that part of the intensification is that our ideas and identities around race, ideology, and religion become stacked on top of people's partisan identities. And other writers have noticed that in this two-party system, which is always so cutthroat, these divisions intensify. In America, we also see that these profound divisions are nursed by partisan media and social media. Taken together, we see a lot of fear of the future generated around these partisan systems. For example, a Pew Research report found that a month before the election, approximately 8 in 10 registered Democratic and Republican voters said their differences with the other side were about core American values, and roughly 9 in 10 in both camps worried that a victory by the other would lead to lasting harm to the United States. And we as a nation that connects these partisan views are very deeply divided over our views on race. And with this incredible divide of perspective that fuels polarization around race, we see those on the fringes becoming increasingly more extreme. Yet for me as a Jewish woman, who comes from a family where our Holocaust trauma was so palpable it could be cut with a knife, I offer a few lessons I've learned through trying to understand such dynamics. I've learned that many radical extremists are also traumatized and score extremely high on adverse childhood experiences. Many never have had access to the liberal educational systems that teach them about the sociology and impacts of race and anti-Semitism. I feel that punching a Nazi in the face will not fix the problem or heal our trauma, because objectification of any kind can be a hindrance to all forms of recovery. I think we must search for the humanity within ourselves and within each other, even when we don't believe it exists, even when it's very hard. And I believe the speakers we have today will help illuminate some of these ideas and will offer progressive solutions beyond hate preceding hate. And so I warmly welcome them now. My first question goes to you, Jesse. Over the last few years, you've been building out what you call a parallel network, a network built on principles antithetical to hate and extremism that operates in a holistic manner, with intersectional programming that engages every level of the social service spectrum, from prevention to strategic communications, counter-messaging, interventions, psychosocial support, activism, rehabilitation, as well as integration. We've basically been preparing for this difficult situation facing the US now, one that could benefit from the conflict prevention work the peacebuilding field has been doing mostly abroad. As mentioned, Parallel Networks is also a recipient of the DHS's recently launched Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program. So, can you set the stage for today's discussion by elaborating on the Parallel Networks ecosystemic model, a model that merges peacebuilding with what you call a trauma and countering violent extremism-informed praxis and terrorism prevention?
Sure. Thank you very much, Lisa. I will start by giving a very basic summary of my background in a former life as a jihadist recruiter. During the period of 2003 until May 2011, 2 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed, I was very active as a prominent promoter of the jihadist worldview, particularly in the English language, and particularly transforming it so that it appealed to a Western American-based audience. One of the things that we intuitively understood was the way to structure networks so that they were resilient, and that it wasn't just about online radicalization, but it was about offering a holistic worldview and giving a voice to those that felt like they were unheard and that were radicalizing based on our content. We were very good at linking online and offline activity. We understood that it is not a solely online phenomenon. And so basically, essentially 2.5 years ago, in conjunction with the NYPD Director of Intelligence that monitored me for several years of my life, we built out a very holistic, what we call an ecosystemic approach to combating polarization, hate, and extremism. And the way that that works is largely a result of some of the impact that the peacebuilding field has had on my own thinking. A lot with an appreciation to network theory, as you referenced, and understanding that network topographies and that network cultures are very key and important. And then the idea that typically what happens in the realm of countering violent extremism here, particularly domestically, is that organizations operate in silos where they either engage in counter messaging, intervention, or some component of the countering violent extremism spectrum. But what we decided was the most important and essential thing to do was to link all of them. And to really look at the intersections between phenomena such as hyperpolarization at a political and cultural level, how that feeds into an enhanced level of radicalization. And even though a very low base rate of radicals go on to become violent extremists, trying to look at how you can mitigate those circumstances. And then also build a network that's parallel to extremist networks that rivals them in size and scope and that can impact everyone, no matter where they are along that continuum. And so we built out a system that we call our light upon light ecosystemic approach. Light upon light is based on the notion that no problem can be solved if you attack it at the same level of consciousness that creates it. And our ultimate idealistic objective has to be to formulate a paradigm shift in the way that our societies, local and nationally, think about the phenomenon of violent extremism in the groups that they belong to. So the light upon light ecosystem is comprised of components that, as you said, sit at each level of the social service intervention spectrum. And it starts with a paradigm for personal and collective alteration that we call our Ctrl+Alt+Del-Hate system, to control the space between stimulus and response, to alter course and make a commitment to nonviolence, but also to learn how to make nonviolent activism as appealing as that which violent extremists offer. And then to delete hate, to utilize the successes that we have to impart a better understanding upon society at large, that we all have a role to play in combating extremism, and that we have to recognize the importance of connecting the phenomenon of violent extremism to the underlying polarization and discord that is tearing apart our social fabric and has been doing so progressively for quite a long time. The Ctrl+Alt+Del-Hate paradigm formulates the way that we go about messaging And with regard to the first space, control, between stimulus and response, it's largely informed by a trauma and violence prevention informed protocol. That allows us to communicate with people that are typically operating from their amygdala, or the emotional part of the brain, and to communicate with them where they are in fight, flight, or freeze, get them to pause in that moment. And once we can get them to pause, we can engage them in one-on-one interventions. And that occurs through the issuance of counter-narrative campaigns. But where counter-messaging and counter-narrative in the past was largely operating in isolation, we started to experiment through the creation of online e-zines, videos, content on the Light Upon Light website, with the idea that counter-messages should be linked to action and a quest for where to go once you connect with us. And so just like we used to do as jihadist recruiters, when someone would absorb the propaganda and reach out, we were able to link our counter-narrative campaigns to our intervention program, which we call Shift Hate, support and help for individuals and families touched by hate. That's a 24/7 helpline. You can contact us by email, on WhatsApp, on Signal, on phone. And at any given time, 24/7 a day, if there's a situation that needs addressed, we can address it. And it has proven rather effective, the linking of counter-messaging and strategic communications to the intervention. But then when you're engaging and you're trying to disengage someone from an extremist movement, the question that always pops into their head when they take that courageous step to say they want to leave the movement is what comes next. And that's where we've built out, several members of which represent individuals that are part of it, our Save Hate initiative. Save Hate is basically Society Against Violent Extremism and Hate. It's a collective of former extremists, survivors of extremist, activists, advocates, people that have supported us, that offers psychosocial supports to those that are leaving the movements coming from the intervention spectrum. And the Save Hate initiative is valuable because as a person like myself engages an individual in a one-on-one intervention, I can connect them to Darrell Davis. I can connect them to Ryan. I can connect them to Hope. And suddenly a new cast of characters is building around them. So we're building a new community. And we're introducing them to what we do, and we're allowing them to heal by engaging with us and giving them a task, giving them a quest, trying to cement a new narrative. Their past and their trauma can be transformed and go in a positive direction. And that links into our final component, where people can come full circle and contribute to our prevention-oriented paradigm that we call escape hate. Escape hate is largely based upon a peace-building approach to conflict prevention, where the voices that are affected by what we're doing in the realm of reconciliation, dialogue, and engagement are able to be transformed, and they're able to become assets at the realm of preventing other people from making the same mistakes. And they're allowing us to add individuals to our parallel network that then becomes growing to the point where it rivals in size and scope and outputs the extremist networks that we try to intervene with. The thing that I think is really important to understand is the role that peace building will play for us going forward, because we've established a countering violent extremism related ecosystem. And we've largely learned from our results. Our Shift Hate intervention program was using only formers at first. One of the things that we recognized was the need to include professional social workers, psychiatrists, mental health practitioners, people with expertise like yourself, Lisa, and unique backgrounds. And that trauma-informed care has really transformed the way that we go about addressing the situations, and we've learned a lot from it. But in the realm of peace building, as we want to connect to getting back to the root causes of the whole phenomenon, it's very important to consider how, especially moving forward post-election, peace building can contribute to broader efforts around the country to do so. Peace building is always focused on addressing the root causes of a phenomenon, of looking at socioeconomic grievances, of looking at the problem through a lens that involves typically empathy and encourages dialogue amongst opposing sides in order to begin a process of healing and reconciliation at a community and individual level. But it's also a realm of practice that incorporates a whole of society approach. And Michael will talk a little bit about the way that DHS has formulated its own whole of society multi-sectoral engagement that we are incredibly supportive of. We believe in localized ownership. We can see people like Ryan will talk today about how he is a representative of Light Upon Light. We operate nationally, but as a resident in Michigan is leading initiatives to get localized voices so we can understand the tailored grievances that are on the ground there. And then basically what we're doing is we're building the capacity of civil society, which is another key component of a peace building approach, so that in partnership with entities and in the support of entities, like we're partnering and thinking about building out this network at a national level with groups like Cure Violence, with groups like the Trust Network that is established by Alliance for Peace Building with great input of Alliance for Peace Building, the organizer of PeaceCon, who has been incredibly influential on my thinking in this area. and thinking about building out ways where we can feed into the local prevention framework that is offered by DHS, where they'll be looking at national issue, but also concentrating on localities so that we can contribute in those spaces to building that multi-sectoral awareness and that community resilience, finding the right localized actors that can represent the voices of those that are promoting community resilience. And Hope and Darrell are perfect examples of that as well. And so the other key component of what we're thinking and how we look at the current situation is we saw that we would probably find ourselves in this situation in 2020 and moved with really, really, really a lot of long weeks, 7 days a week, 24/7 amount of work to prepare for this situation. We've been focused on learning about interventions, but now we're really going to transition into making that ecosystemic approach come full circle going forward in 2021. And an important thing to point out at an event like PeaceCon is that in late 2019, right before the COVID pandemic broke out, due to the advocacy and activism of the Alliance for Peacebuilding in conjunction with key politicians, we passed a Global Fragility Act that will allocate a large portion of money to develop conflict prevention mechanisms abroad. But I think that when we look at our current domestic situation, we also need to consider that we are largely in need of a domestic fragility act of sorts here on our home shores. And that conflict prevention and lessons from peacebuilding synthesized with a countering violent extremism expertise that has been developing. I'm very totally supportive of the direction that DHS is going. I also think we need to expand the role of other sectors of government, local, state, and particularly health and human services. But with that, I'll sort of close and open it up. That's the paradigm that we've set forth. A lot of it is based on trauma-informed care. Welcome to continue to discuss that in the Q&A. Pass it off. Thank you.
Great, Jesse. Thank you so much. These are really innovative, multifaceted, multi-level intervention frameworks that move beyond organizational silos. Now we will hear from Darrell Davis. Darrell, can you please describe the intervention work you are doing and why you have chosen these approaches? Oh, we can't hear you now.
Thank you, Liza. I started out working with predominantly members of the KKK, and then it expanded to neo-Nazis and members of the alt-right, all under the umbrella of white supremacy or white nationalism. And I found it to be important because I feel that our society, or anybody's society, can only become one of two things. One, it can become that which we sit back and watch it become, or two, it can become that which we stand up and make it become. And we all have to ask ourselves the question, do I want to sit back and see what my country becomes, or do I want to stand up and make it become what I want to see? And I've chosen the second approach. And that, to understand that, you have to understand a little bit of my background. I'm 62 years old now, and I grew up as a child of parents in the U.S. Foreign Service. I was an American embassy brat. I started traveling at the age of 3 overseas and living in foreign countries. Today, music is my profession, but trying to better race relations has become my obsession. So when you combine my travels as a child with my adult travels as a performer and a lecturer around the world, I've now been in a total of 57 different countries on 6 continents, and I've performed in 49 of our 50 states. So I've literally been exposed to a multitude of people, cultures, ethnicities, religions, etc. And all of that has helped shape who I've become today. And no matter how far I go from this country, my own country, the United States, whether it's right next door to Canada or to Mexico or halfway around the globe, and no matter how many different people I see, different languages I hear, different belief systems I encounter, when I get home, I conclude one thing. We all are human beings. And as such, we all want basically the same 5 things out of life. We want to be loved. We want to be respected. We want to be heard. We want to be treated fairly. And we want the same thing for our family as anybody else wants for theirs. And as long as we keep those 5 core values in mind, we can navigate better any society, whether it's domestically with white supremacy or whatever, or halfway around the world, when we keep those human values in mind. And so with that in mind, I set out to try to find out what makes the mind think in a superior mindset, that somebody is better than someone else because of how they worship or because of their skin color. And I began having conversations with Klan leaders and Klan members. And then, of course, it expanded to neo-Nazis and others, whether they were involved in a group or individuals. And I found that in having that conversation, we would have an exchange of ideas, and we each were learning something about the other that dispelled beliefs on both of our sides. Some of the things that I thought about Klan members, for example, ended up not being true. Some of the things they thought about Black people or about Jewish people or about whoever ended up not being true. So, as my friend Jesse Morton would say, a missed opportunity for dialogue is a missed opportunity for conflict resolution. And that is so true. And I frame these not as debates, but as conversations, an exchange in ideas, because one's perspective is one's reality. Whatever you perceive becomes your reality. And you cannot go out and change somebody's reality. That's impossible. What you can do is offer someone different perspectives. And when they investigate those perspectives and one resonates with them, they change their own reality. And I've seen many times where the media will say Black musician converts X number of white supremacists or Klansmen or what have you. Simply not true. I did not even convert one. They converted themselves. I was simply the impetus for these masses of people to change their ideology. And that's because I offered different perspectives. We all are human beings. We all have some inherent good in us. Even people in the KKK and white supremacy are good people, maybe with bad ideas. And we have to elicit the humanity in others and show them the right way, offer them different perspectives, and allow them to come to those conclusions themselves. Another thing that I offer, and I've been doing this for 37 years now, is when these people decide to get out of those movements or out of that ideology, they are left out there by themselves. Because many times, if they come from a family that does not have a background of supremacy, that family tends to distance themselves from their child because they don't want that embarrassment, especially if they have Jewish or Black friends. And the family that they join, the supremacist family that they join, once they leave and they renounce it, they can't go back. They've already betrayed that family. So they're out here swinging in the wind by themselves. They still need to be heard, loved, respected, treated fairly, and they still want the same thing for themselves as you want for yourself. So you have to offer a support system. And that's another thing that I offer, because without that support, once they leave, then they're going to gravitate to wherever they can get those things, whether it's another cult-like group, another supremacist group, alcohol, drugs, what have you. They will go somewhere until they become strong enough to do it on their own. So it is crucial that that support is in place when they decide to make that decision, because that is a big decision to leave your family, whether it's your biological family or your supremacist family. So I provide these things. I also provide a sounding board for people who want to express, their beliefs and their ideas and their frustrations. And we are able to talk it out, because when two enemies are talking, they are not fighting. They're talking. They may be disagreeing, but at least they're talking. And it's when the conversation ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. So my key is to keep the conversation going. And the more we communicate with one another, the more things we find in common with one another. While we start this far apart as adversaries, you talk with your worst enemy for 5 minutes, you will find something in common. and that chasm begins to close in. You keep on talking, the gap gets smaller and smaller. Now you have established a relationship with your adversary, and you continue that conversation. You're heading towards a friendship because you look forward to talking with one another and learning from one another. And by the time you get here, the trivial things that you have in contrast, such as the color of your skin, or whether you go to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, begin to matter less and less. And that's where we want to go. We want to start moving in the right direction. And that takes a lot of patience. It does not happen overnight. And this is why parallel networks is so crucial to being the key and the formula for these things. Because a lot of people, they want things instantly, especially in our world. We want things yesterday. And unfortunately, we can't get things that quickly. These ideologies that people have adopted, they don't come into the person overnight. They are saturated with them. They come over time. And they're going to leave over time. They're not going to leave overnight. So that's why it's crucial that we are there every step of the way. We help plant the seeds. We help nurture those seeds by watering them, nurturing them so they bloom up the right way. And when that person leaves that family's security or whatever, whether it's false security or real security of that belief system, we are there to help them move into the next phase.
Great. Thank you so much, Darrell. Unfortunately, we're just out of time as my timer is buzzing off. I have to say that I really admire your compassion and your willingness to listen to those with very different ideologies and ideas, as well as your desire to advocate and assist these individuals. And I agree that humanity is key and communication is key to making big changes around these issues. So on that note, we'll now hear from Ryan Lurie. Brian, you have been on quite a journey from radicalization to peacebuilding. Can you please tell us more about it and about the work that you're doing?
Yes, and I just want to say thank you to everybody that's already spoke on the panel and to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for inviting us here to speak today too. First off, my name's Ryan Lurie. I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, a somewhat small city in Michigan. I have a beautiful wife and 6 children who keep me peaceful and happy on most days and showed me what unconditional love actually is. It was people like Darrell also, and not Darrell himself individually, but other people like Darrell that showed me that same unconditional love and treated me like a human being that really ultimately allowed me to start my de-radicalization and my healing process. Like Jesse had said, I was part of a skinhead organization called the Rolling with Skins, which was an offshoot of the National Socialist movement. We were trying to put ourselves on the map. So we were really trying to get ourselves into social media, involve ourselves in spread across the world more and mainstreaming what white supremacy was, at that time when social media was just coming around. I found myself having to commit crimes to keep an organization like that going. We have to finance it somehow. And so on the side, I was committing crimes and I got myself into some trouble. In that trouble, I allowed myself to separate myself from the group. It wasn't that I chose to at the time. I was forced to, obviously, being locked up in prison. But during that time, my wake up started to happen. While I was in jail, I was jumped and I was beaten pretty badly. During that time, nobody in the hate group that was actually in the same floor with me on the jail came to my aid, but my black cellmate did. And to this day, people like him have been there to come to me and give me the support when I needed it. If it hadn't been for somebody like him, I probably would have went back to more of like an inward organizing. Like Darrell says, guys like me in the past, reformers, we don't necessarily go back to the same group because they wouldn't accept us back in for speaking out against things. But we might go to something else more extreme, sometimes even to the left and a further extreme. And I had to keep myself from doing that. I also had to focus on what was really affecting me on a daily basis. Why was I so hateful and mad at the world? And what I found was, after talking to psychologist after psychologist and psychiatrist, was that I had faced a lot of trauma in my life from the time I grew up. I was sexually, physically abused, mentally abused from my father and my uncle at a very young age. Every person that my mom was ever with, husband or boyfriend, was very abusive to her, tried to commit suicide on many occasions. And so because of this, I had faced a lot of things, fighting all the time, in and out of school, suspended, expelled, and really battling any type of authority throughout my whole life. I joined the Army before I had actually even came in to the Rolling Woods Skins, and I found myself even fighting authority there most days. So we started to really centralize and really target that trauma. My psychologist, who's an amazing woman, helped me to figure out that those things really honestly were what were kind of controlling me on a daily basis, because I was allowing them to. I had to really figure out how to take those things and wash them out of my subconscious, is realizing that it's always going to be there. We're never fully healed, but it is a long process. And through that process, other things, I kept myself busy by reading a lot and educating myself, and also involving myself in local events and things that were going on to help the community build themselves back up. Growing up in Flint, Michigan, most people know about the water crisis there. I was very, very involved in our fight back to get clean water for the city of Flint, actually working with the city of Flint on the GLEWA contract to provide water to the city of Flint. Through that, I met a lot of different organizers that talked about storytelling, people, POC, that wouldn't give up on me for the past mistakes that I had made. They came to me and treated me like a human being. And they also told me that my story was very important to tell. For the longest time, I felt like I couldn't tell my story to the community because I would just be condemned. I would go right back into that same hole again and never be able to pull myself out of that depression. But I had some really good supportive people that said, we're here with you. We're going to help you out. They stood by me like my wife is today, and helped to lift me up and to be a better person. I started to tell my story, and I seen how it actually helped people. And then I started having people actually reach out to me, people that were in extremist groups that didn't want to be there anymore. And so I decided it's time to understand. It's time to understand why they joined. It's time to understand why people join extremist groups altogether as a whole. And I found that we all had a lot in common. It wasn't just me that was dealing with a lot of the trauma. They all had dealt with almost the same exact type of things, whether they were sexually abused, physically abused, or didn't have a family that was there to be supportive of them at all, give them any kind of love. And I said, man, there's something we've got to do about this. We have to, make the table open to understand, because, Jesse has said this to me before. We can be empathetic to the person doesn't mean that we have to be sympathetic to them. So just because we sit down at a table and have a conversation doesn't mean that I have to totally agree with everything that they're talking to us. But it's the only way that we'll ever be able to get back to a conversation and actually move forward to possibly even de-radicalize that person. I saw this work on many occasions. I started a mixed martial arts program that allowed teenagers that were facing or were in gangs or inner city gangs, extremist groups from the rural areas, or even inner city skinhead groups that were actually flocking to our mixed martial arts program, mostly because of it being a program that, in a way, you say it's violent, but we were taking that violence and turning it into something that was structured, disciplined, teach them that, you have somebody here that can be a mentor to you, that you have hope. One of the biggest things in Flint was that in a city that's had a lot happen to them when it comes to recession from General Motors, from the water crisis, and we can talk about, a lot of different things that happen to our city. It's very, very easy to lose hope. And hope is a very important thing for us to remind each other of, so that we can lift our spirits and pull ourselves out of where we were before. So through doing that and through all my work, I've done a lot of different work with different organizations. I consult now with an organization in Flint called REACT, where we work on policy for policing, not to defund police, not to get rid of police at all, but to work with local law enforcement and to actually find, solutions that will work within the community. And then through that, I was actually called, and Jesse Morton reached out to me to talk to me about their Ctrl+Alt+Delete program, hate program. And the campaign was what I had been doing all along and what I had saw some other people doing. And sometimes when you're independently working and you don't have that team or that family there, you can feel like your tires are just spinning at times, or you just don't have that amount of support and financial help to allow your organization to grow, to help more people. And we know today that a lot of organizations end up fizzling out because they don't have the funding that's necessary to help them, hire the correct amount of people, to bring researchers in. And one of the things that I noticed right off the bat was that Parallel Networks and Light Upon Light had already started to pull a family together. They treat everybody with respect. A pro-humanity approach that I've heard Darrell talk about before. It's beautiful. We can sit here and we can say anti-racist all day. We can say putting anti in front of anything automatically throws red flags up for people. And so if we can actually go,
I'm sorry.
Okay. If we can actually go from this pro-human approach, it really honestly helps us to look at each other as humans. As soon as we dehumanize somebody, as soon as we decide that they're any less than a human being, we've already failed that mission on that person. Everybody are human beings. We all make mistakes. We can learn from those mistakes and become amazing, productive members of society. And I've seen it happen. My story to tell. I know a lot of other formers who have amazing stories that they could tell you too, what they're doing in their communities. And it's also important to have us on the front lines. In the state of Michigan, for instance, right now, we are dealing with some very extreme groups. Now, Michigan has had a long history of violence, anti-Semitism, extremism as a whole. And that goes all the way back to Henry Ford, where he passed out leaflets across the country and was actually able to have somebody that formed basically the American Nazi Party at the time, who brought over 20,000 Nazis into Madison Square Gardens. We had Timothy McVeigh, who, read right out of the Turner Diaries for the most part on what he did, who hooked up with the Michigan militia here and, committed the Oklahoma City bombing in '95. Most recently, to talk about, what's really hitting us today is with polarization in our country and with partisan politics being so divided, we've actually had groups offshoot like the Wolverine Group, who claims to be a militia, but it's an extremist group, or the Base, who just most recently did was arrested and indicted on some charges here in the state of Michigan. Wolverine, so most people know, is the group that actually threatened and was going to basically kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. They were going to take her and put her on trial and then execute her if they thought that it was something that needed to be done publicly. And they thought that was going to help society. They also were going to blow up bridges in the state of Michigan to blame on the left to cause what they called a civil war, an accelerationist group. So it's very, very important that there are formers like me that know how these organizations work, know how they organize, know how to keep an eye on them so that we can help with intervention. So if the DHS, FBI, some other type of intelligence community tells us, hey, this guy, he doesn't look like he's going to cause any form of violence right now, but we definitely think that your program could work. We're there to make sure that our program can go knock on these guys' doors, take them out to coffee, find out who they are, find out what it is that has drove them to the point of where they are today, what drove them to that extremism, and hopefully bring them back into the regular world and being a productive member of society, whether they go back to be a civil rights leader or whatever it may be, but it takes them and de-radicalizes them. And that's what's most important right now with the country being as divided as we are.
Absolutely, Ryan. Absolutely, Ryan. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, we're just out of time.
No, you're good. You're good. So I appreciate you guys having me, and I look forward to hearing from everybody else.
Absolutely. Ryan, you've gone through a lot, and it sounds like you've also learned a lot. Thank you for connecting how trauma plays into radicalization, as well as what elements you incorporated to develop your path of recovery. I think your story is very important in helping us to understand how individuals arrive in these movements and also how we can help them to recover. The next person that I'd like to bring forward into this discussion is Hope Hyder, who has an extremely important story. Hope, can you please tell your story and describe the wisdom that you've drawn from it?
Yes, I'm really
Hope, it's hard to hear you for some reason.
How about now? Can you?
You're a little choppy.
It might just be my audio. How about? No.
Still a bit choppy. I always say it's not a real meeting without a technical issue. So hopefully we've just made it a real meeting.
Let's see. How about now? Is that
Unfortunately not.
Lisa, let's go to Michael, and then we'll come back to Hope, and we can help Hope troubleshoot.
Hope we'll get you there, I'm sure. So we're going to move on now to Michael, and I'm really excited to hear Michael actually speak. Michael, you have been both personally affected by violent extremism and also support the DHS in its efforts to mitigate violent extremism. Can you please tell us more about yourself and the work that you're doing at the DHS?
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Fantastic. It's a real pleasure to be here today with each of you in your respective virtual locations at PeaceCon 2020. Thanks to Liz Hume with AFP, as well as you for moderating this panel. Behind the scenes, it's really an honor to share this panel with each of you here. Jesse and Ryan as individuals continuing to pivot your former lives into future lives for good and really teaching us humanity. Hope is somebody who's transferred her pain for good, someone I can deeply relate to. And Darrell, an incredible inspiration whose work I learned about after watching him on PBS about 3 or 4 years ago. I join you today as a very proud representative of the Department of Homeland Security. And I say proud because I've had the privilege of working with some great folks as a federal employee for the past 13 years, both inside and outside of government. And I'm specifically proud to have served for the last 4 to 5 years in the space that we call prevention. And I'm very passionate about prevention work because it is personal to me as somebody who's experienced a trauma, as this panel recognizes here today. In fact, domestic violent extremists had killed my father. And not just domestic violent extremists as we see that in the United States, it was actually in Spain. While on a business trip in Madrid, just before he left for a jog before work one day, Basque ETA separatists targeted a bus of 16 law enforcement officers who were transiting the area, and they planted a car bomb on his running route that morning. So he was not the intentional target of the attack, but he was struck by the blast, hospitalized, and ultimately succumbed to his injuries, dying on September 11th, 1985. So now 35 years later, I'm actually carrying out my life's work. Violence space provides a framework to interpret the world and life events and offers a justifying narrative for action, just as Jesse and Ryan have described. Darrell said earlier too, our 5 needs: to be loved, to be respected, heard, treated fairly, and having the same wishes for other families as we would wish for our own. This very much aligns with the needs that we're identifying at DHS and what should be addressed as part of something that goes beyond security. We have the opportunity to address personal factors like individuals' need for purpose or identifying needs that have not been met, whether it's power, self-esteem, or achievement. We have the opportunity to address group factors like an individual's pursuit of a collective identity or need to fit in. We have the opportunity to address community factors, the factors by which an individual identifies with or against. This might be religious discrimination, tensions with law enforcement, or mistrust of government. And we also have opportunities to address socio-political factors too. Political and societal level conditions and grievances can drive an individual's identity, and it defines really the lens through which they see things, and specifically as an attack against their values. So the office where I work, OTVTP, we focus on developing local prevention frameworks, and we're currently working to define the baseline criteria of what constitutes one of these, following the mandate set forth last year in our department's strategic framework to combat terrorism and targeted violence, which I can share the link with this group if interested. Specifically, our office, OTVTP, is constructed of 5 lines of effort. I'm one of 12 regional prevention coordinators nationwide. We come from a variety of different backgrounds from the private sector, social work, state government, former military. The reason for our diversity of perspectives is because we do believe in that whole of society, multi-sector approach. And we want to work with folks who can build these local prevention frameworks, which don't always look the same in one state to another, which I'm sure through Darrell's travels in 49 states of the nation can recognize and appreciate. We also have a prevention education unit as well, where we develop content and curriculum for community and stakeholder engagement. We're mostly known for our community awareness briefing, our CAB. Essentially, we go into communities and we speak with stakeholders to discuss the factors that I mentioned above, the personal, social, group, socio-political factors, the radicalization of violence process. We look at case studies as well, and then we also talk about prevention frameworks and try to identify folks that can lead the development of those local prevention frameworks and support intervention type of work. We also have a team that does sector engagement, and these folks are developing sector-specific strategies, so we know how to engage with, for example, the tech sector, social workers, educators, and law enforcement. All of these elements are different parts of a society, and they require different levels of engagement and different types of engagement. So that sector engagement team works with national level organizations to inform their work. We also have a policy and research group which examines the literature, exchanges best practices to advance this space of prevention. And then finally, we also have our grants team. My office just issued $10 million to 29 organizations, not $10 million each, but split $10 million across 29 different organizations to include one organization that's represented here on the panel as well. And we're really trying to seed the development of these local prevention frameworks to really support a national effort that really addresses societal. I started my presentation just talking about, my position as a Department of Homeland Security employee. And I hope that by speaking on this panel and with you today that you can recognize also the human side of some of your government officials too. We really are, there's really some good folks trying to do some really good things, and it's an honor to be here today, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. I think it's amazing how you've parlayed so much of your personal pain towards CVE efforts and found a place to do this through DHS's comprehensive whole of society approaches. I think it's amazing how multifaceted this program is, working from the individual, community, and macro levels. I'm hoping now, Hope, can we hear you? Hope, can you hear us?
I don't.
All right. Hope, I think you might be on mute. And I think she may have stepped out and come back in. So essentially, it's very interesting, the work that all of you are doing at different levels. And you can see how our organization really comes and brings in so many different forces, so many different perspectives. And I'm just very grateful to have you all here today. I know that we were going to move over into a Q&A period. And maybe as Hope kind of figures out what she's doing just technologically, in this time, we can take a few questions from the public for those that have spoken. Does that sound good to you, Jesse?
Yeah, I think that's good. But when Hope comes back in, we'll try to let her respond to a question and tell her story as well.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's the best way to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm alerting the public. If you have certain questions, we're going to be looking at some of them.
There's one at the top, Lisa, that we could start with while they filter in their questions.
Okay.
Of the chat. It's on New Zealand.
Okay, New Zealand is still recovering from the terrorist attack. An inquiry reminded that New Zealand improves its CVE approach. What is the most important policies to focus on to prevent far-right extremism and to improve social cohesion? Where to start?
So I'll start, and then we can go around. I mean, the Christchurch shooting was a tragedy, and it underlies the ideology of the Great Replacement, which Darrell has recently written an article for our Ctrl+Alt+Del-Hate magazine about 2042, the year that the Caucasian population in the United States is expected to become a minority. The Great Replacement in Europe is largely driven by Muslim immigration, but has mutated into a way where it resonates as a transnational movement. And I think that's exemplified by the Christchurch killer. He was not a native New Zealander. And today, they kind of tried to suggest that social media was solely responsible in a monocausal way for his radicalization. In a response, in the aftermath of the attack, they also called upon countries to come together and governments to come together to force or to pressure Facebook, YouTube, and other mainstream social media platforms to do more to combat radical speech. And the V. Conte was popular for a while. And so if we're going to base our CVE frameworks on this notion that is really plagued by low base rate bias, that if there's a low number of individuals that radicalize, that go on to become violent extremists, we have to be very careful to implement practices in countering violent extremism that actually make the problem worse, but we don't look to measure it, because that's one of the values of peace building, is an appreciation for complexity, right? Second and third order effects of any policy or intervention are very crucial. And I would say that that's where it comes into talking with former extremists are particularly valuable in letting you know how they adapt. There's a stereotype about violent extremists that in some way they're just miseducated, or they are sort of insane. We used to believe in a terrorist profile. We got away from that. And hope is back. So I will end with that. But I really think that the ecosystemic approach that we develop, and one based on trauma-informed care and empathetic dialogue, is much more effective. And so with that, I'll end, and maybe we can let other people answer the New Zealand question and then go to Hope for her narrative. Lisa, you're on mute, I think.
Anyone else want to take a stab at this question?
Well, just very briefly, I agree with everything that that Jesse said. And I would say, we really need to start being more proactive than reactive. A lot of people take their cues from the things that we do in this country, like the Christchurch shooter had referenced Dylan Roof, who was an American, and a lot of these things are perpetuated by things that have started over here. So if we're going to be a leader, then we need to be proactive. And just like, we teach children, not to play with fire, not to steal, not to do this and do that, and wash their hands. Let's start with kids in school. Let's teach them about preventing terrorism later on. It's to our benefit in the future that they don't grow up and have these issues. Or if they see the symptoms of them coming, they know on their own how to combat them. We do a good job about educating kids about many other things, but let's start educating them about terrorism, because terrorism is real, and we need to prevent it from affecting our children. They get on technology is a wonderful thing, but it's bittersweet. It's like fire. You can take fire and heat somebody's house, or you can take fire and burn their house down. So we have to know how to navigate technology. We encourage kids not to, or we have controls or influence them not to watch certain things on TV. We have all those controls in our remote control and things like that. Let's teach them about terrorism so they don't go down these YouTube rabbit holes and read the wrong book and watch the wrong video and end up self-recruiting or self-radicalizing. And that's incumbent upon us as adults and experts.
Darrell, that's a great point. In fact, the Department of Homeland Security has hosted 5 digital forums on terrorism prevention, where we connect tech sector companies with community leaders and community organizations and members of civil society, so that way we can find out ways to use technology for good as well, because technology certainly gets the tech sector gets a lot of negative press for availing that platform to us. But if it wasn't for that platform, we wouldn't be here today. So there's a positive to it as well. So how do we eliminate social isolation? How do we connect people for good? So I put the name of our website at dhs.gov/tvtp on the chat if anybody's interested in those digital forums on terrorism prevention, some of the reports that we've published.
Thank you.
Yeah, and on that note, we do have a question for you, Michael, which comes from Robert Benton. And he asks, do you find certain programs you've encountered work better than others? I've heard no one has yet cracked the code on arresting radicalization.
That's a good question, Robert. Thanks for your question. First of all, radicalization is legal. I just want to be clear there. The Department of Homeland Security is not getting into starting de-radicalization programs. We're American. We have the First Amendment, and that type of dialogue, the good work that interventionists are doing, is availed to us because radicalization is legal. We get concerned in that violence space. I'll tell you that our office, the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, funded a grants program in 2016 where we funded $10 million for the first time. And based on the results of that grants program, we've actually identified 6 intervention models for replication, and each model was supported by 2 or more grant projects with preliminary results, suggesting that it could be successfully replicated, whether this is training members for the public, community-led resilience building, training law enforcement-led youth resilience building, regional prevention planning and implementation, and intervention capabilities. I know those are all a lot of verbiage there coming from your government friend here on the line. I can put that more information in the chat as well to discuss and expand upon what that means. But we're using that grant program as an opportunity to find promising practices. It's too early to call them best practices because we want to see the sustainability of this type of work. But if that information can be available and replicated, we might have opportunities for future success. And I'm happy to connect with you offline as well. So thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. Hope?
Hey, Lisa, we could use the question from David Steele in the box, and I think that Hope can answer it with regard to her narrative so that we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone if possible.
Oh, I love this idea. So this is from
Can
David.
you hear me, though? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic.
So how do you help people to reframe their sense of identity, yet not deny the aspects of their identity that are distinctive, e.g., remaining a member of specific religious communities, yet separating from any destructive ideology? So Hope, I want to try and incorporate this story.
I think that one of the ways that you help people reframe their sense of identity is by really getting them to talk about how they even frame their identity in the first place. How is it that they know who they are, and how is it that they came to the conclusion about who they know that they are? Sometimes most people find that they have actually borrowed their identity from someone else's idea of what they should be versus who they really believe that they are. And sometimes even asking those questions can start to help a person discover and really deconstruct who they think they are and really understand that they have the right to independently address who they want to be in the world. That it doesn't have to be their parents or the people around them or something they see on TV or any other idea that we give someone else. We have the right to question any information that comes our way, especially when it comes to how we're going to show up in the world. So I think that one way to help people reframe their identity is to help them deconstruct what their identity is and get them to really look into the nuances of how they form the identity that they are operating with in the world, and that they have the freedom to change that if they're not satisfied, if they're not happy.
Thank you, Hope. And Hope, do you want to talk more about just your life experiences now?
I apologize for the technical difficulties, everybody. Really honored to be here talking to people about peace, which is something that we don't often hear people really talking about. I'm a big believer that peace is here, it already exists and that we are disturbing it with the way that we behave. And so I feel that makes me feel like it's not something we're working towards, it's something that we actually want to preserve and protect. That's actually already here. My father was murdered when I was 6 years old in a racially motivated hate crime. And it wasn't in my early 20s that I really had the capacity to even face the grief that I had experienced. And Ryan, you were talking about hope and how important it is. And my name is Hope, but I've experienced a lot of despair. And my name really is something that always kind of kept me connected to the concept of hope, even when I didn't have that much hope, within myself. And my own healing experience of just realizing I hadn't dealt with my father's death. I needed to really face all the emotions that were there and really just opening up to that reality. All these tools came to my life, including this opportunity to be here today is another part of that healing journey that came to my assistance when I just said, I need help. Just asked out loud, I just need help, I need to heal. And all these different opportunities came to do so, including starting to be responsible for writing letters to the Parole Commission to keep the person who murdered my father in prison. And I started to be involved with that, writing letters, and then eventually I was able to meet him for the first time. And all the healing I did gave me the capacity to meet him as a human being. And for my brother also, we both had done a lot of healing that helped us to really meet him face to face and tell him what the impact of his choices had been. For him, it was just 15 minutes of his life. And my whole life, I had kind of been in a relationship with him because of his decision to kill my father. And even in his decision making, it was in my healing process, I learned that the choices he made weren't necessarily to kill my father. He didn't go out maybe with that desire to do so, but his activities kind of led to that. And so in my healing process, just dealing with why someone does something like this, how is that they even start to think that it's appropriate to hurt another person? All those questions I had been asking over the years, I got a chance to really talk to him about and ask him, how is it that he became this kind of person who thought that it was okay to hurt another human being? And I think just my own healing helped me prepare for understanding that I'm meeting a person who made some poor choices, but he was a person who was also part of a family, part of a community. And he had never really even thought about the fact that the person he killed had children or a mother or a father or a community around him, people who were all impacted by the choices that the person who killed my father made, at that time. So talking with him, he even had the response of saying, I didn't even think about the impact of what I had done to anyone. His father had died in a hospital bed. He's like, your father died, on the grass outside after I beat him. I didn't even really think about what I had done. And he had been in prison for over 30 years at that point. So even all that time, he had never really faced the impact of the choice that he had made, a few choices he had made within a short span of time, that really reverberated out into my life, obviously, and the lives of, everyone that, I knew, and in my own life, in wrestling with what kind of world is this, where a person even comes to be able to make this kind of decision. And so I think that question has always been something that I've wrestled with and wanted to answer. And so the day I finally got to meet him, and I've met him twice so far, really got to discuss with him how it is that he came to become a person making those kinds of choices, where he learned to bring resolution through violence, how he made his choices, as a person. I never expected to really feel his humanity in the way that I did, and my brother did when we first met him, to really walk away with, I think Darrell mentioned it and Ryan too, when you have conversation with someone, it does create a common ground where you may have never had one before. Just the act of having a conversation. really gives you that kind of framework for saying we've done something together. We're all this time I just been, this person is over here, he did this thing that killed my father and took him away, but because of that, he was always with me. And for me, to live in this world and have a sense of hope, I had to come to terms with this idea that my life, and no matter what had happened to me, was still valuable enough to continue to want to be here for and to enjoy and to really have the capacity to be with whatever happens to anyone. And that's what the exposure to that kind of trauma has done for me. I was exposed so early that I really have a resilience to really meet anyone wherever they are with whatever they're going through because of the extremes that I've been through. It helps me really be unfazed by what someone has to offer up. And it's whatever their truth is. Even if it's the person who killed my father, being able to look him in the eye and speak clearly to him about what he had done to me and my family and his family also, who was robbed of a son and robbed of all the things that he could have contributed to them that he wasn't able to, because he's, spent his life in prison. So that's how I came to parallel networks, just as a person who has been impacted, but also sees the value of peace and knowing that I want to live in peace. If I can't speak to someone who I don't agree with or who may have done something to a person in my family that obviously devastated my life in many ways, then I can't live in peace. It can't just be for me. It has to be for everyone. It's mandatory. So that's that's kind of it. Yeah.
Hope, thank you so much. I have to say that, I remember once asking you how to move past the anger incited by members of my family who were deeply affected by the Holocaust and were acting out in a lot of violence. And I remember you helped me to understand how a person is so deeply influenced by everything they were ever exposed to and whatever they weren't exposed to. And how these issues are so much larger than the individual. And I have to say, I think that this was one of the most important parts of my own recovery. And I truly thank you for being who you are and for being on the path that you've been on, because it's just so miraculous to see where you are at this point in time and to watch it grow. On that note, I imagine a lot of people were deeply inspired by the story, and I do have a question which I think is relevant, about trauma from Anne Solanas. If trauma is so prevalent among extremists, do we have an extremism problem or a trauma problem? If it is a trauma problem, what are the system-level reforms or changes needed to support trauma healing? I open this up to the group.
I'll mention briefly and try to leave enough space for other people to mention, because a lot of what we have arrived at is we don't have data that suggests that in every case of radicalization into violent extremism, there is a traumatic circumstance in the background. But what we do realize in our experiences in building out our organization is that if you dig far enough and you get a person to get comfortable enough to tell you their narrative, it oftentimes takes 2-3 months, but there's trauma in the background, and typically complex trauma. Research by Pete Sini has shown that the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, and Lisa, you mentioned this a little bit. So we have some preliminary understanding, particularly of the far right, that their ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences scores from amongst far right-wing extremists, are 3 times the base rate of the population and significantly higher than a control group of juvenile delinquents. Right. And in the jihadist world, typically we say, oh, they outperform in educational levels their counterparts, but that's with regard to the Middle East. And we need to distinguish between those that are radicalizing in Western contexts that are suffering from negative experiences with like integration and things of that nature. And so I don't think that trauma can be considered the sole driver of violent extremism, but I do think that when we are learning more and more scientifically speaking about how to address trauma at an individual and a collective level, it offers the solution for how we can formulate holistic programming that can actually impart a way where we can mitigate the risks of someone coming up with the idea in their head that there's no recourse but violence to attend their grievances, because we can build societies that are built upon what Bessel van der Kolk, who in his classic work, Body Keeps the Score, referred to as, we have all of this knowledge about trauma, and it is a route to what he calls a trauma-conscious society. And I believe that if we're going to really heal the situations that we face today, we need to understand that 20 years into the war on terror, we're basically living in a collective state of PTSD with widening economic gaps, with widening cultural gaps, with widening conflict at home, largely as a result of a war of attrition that has been waged on us from afar, and a reaction to it that split the world into black and white. That is discomforting for some people to hear, but it has left us awfully traumatized and unable to induce a paradigm shift that would give us the ability to maybe reconsider the idea that the United States shouldn't necessarily be as involved in abroad unless it can be a city on the hill that can project its way of life domestically so that other people want to adopt it. We've lost a lot of our ability to send that soft power around the world, and that affects our ability to do peace building and all of the other situations that would allow us to address root conflicts and conflict drivers in the international level. And so basically, when we built out our programming, one thing we learned was that we really needed to take from a trauma-informed care approach, which allows us to create safety. They trust us, right? These are the 6 principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness, peer support, the Save Hate initiative, putting new cast of characters around them, and then co-creation with them. We give them something to do. They contribute to the cause. They get a sense of meaning. They get a sense of belonging, and we're healing that all under trauma-informed interventions in regard to the one-on-one interventions, and building a lot of our interventions around trauma-informed practices. And then you get that empowerment where they feel like they've restructured an identity and they can give back to their community or give back to our organization or what have you. But that also has to be framed in deep appreciation for cultural and historical understanding and how identities are formulated due to this attachment to a cultural narrative that can be restructured but must not be assaulted before you build the rapport. And Darrell can talk largely about that because he's the best expert, I believe, in probably the world, maybe the country, in facilitating that. So I'll end there, but I do think there's tons to be learned from what we're learning about how to address trauma and how it might apply to the realm of countering violent extremism.
Thank you, Jesse. Anyone else have any thoughts? All right, I have a good question, which I'm merging 2 questions together because they are related. This part of it is from Chris Church. How can we effectively use storytelling and narrative creation within the US and worldwide to reduce extremist ideology? And how do we build trust in the stories and narratives shared? And then from Gwen Olton, what are your favorite communication strategies for creating fertile ground for dialogue?
Anyone? Maybe I'll speak on behalf of the organization and talk generally about all of us. I mean, you see the transformative narratives here today, and we have so many other individuals that could have sat on this panel that we have been deeply affected by. As an individual who built this out after collapsing, personal revelation is I decided to become a public former jihadist and fell apart. I had removed the ideology, but hadn't realized the trauma and deep healing that needed to be done. Relapsed on alcohol and drugs for the first time in 14 years and basically threw away what I thought was the opportunity of a lifetime, and then dedicated myself to building out this organization because I knew that it was something the work to engage gave me the meaning, significance, and purpose that allowed me to heal and actually transform my own personal narrative. And then through understanding how to transform my own personal narrative, was able to connect with like-minded individuals that I've learned so much from everybody here, including Michael, who upon, meeting with DHS told me, hey, it's unfortunate what happened to you, but this is DHS official. It will stick with me for the rest of my life. It told me if you ever run into stress and anxiety and you need somebody to talk to, feel free to reach out, when he lived in DC. And I'll never forget that, because for me, my de-radicalization involved a great deal of government involvement. I probably would never have de-radicalized if I didn't have contact with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. and developed a level of care with a woman who was an FBI agent that became sort of a surrogate mother and became the first woman figure in my life that had ever really done much to really support me and to defend me. And that was significant. But it's the power of transformative narratives that we use to connect to these individuals, because in the power of transformation is a universal story that taps into all of us, right? We all understand, and I think Americans, better so than most, are ultimately forgiving. And we don't come at people with regard to challenging them, with regard to demonizing them, because how can we? Because we've learned from our life experiences going out into the real world, getting off of Twitter, and going out and living life in the real world, that the only thing that works is to see the good in people. And that you get this experience when you do see the good in people, where you're relieved of a body of burden. Your shadow self trying to live can start to heal. And that taps into the level of doing trauma. And there's many people participating here today that would be more qualified to talk about the power of transformative narrative than me. Kia Dillard is working with us on a program for DHS that will reduce recidivism risks in prison and contact those that are susceptible. And they've been working with powerful narratives, her team out in LA, with regard to facilitating our implementation of that program and prison system out there. Recognizing the power of narrative. And when we started to build out the curriculum and started to build out what we're going to implement, everything came together. Even though that we've been living lives on different parts of the country and experiences, they read the initial rough draft and the thinking, and they're like, yeah, this is exactly what we already found is true too. Same thing, you meet Darrell and you find out that this power of transformation induces this empathy inside of you. So it is the power of narrative. And we're starting to learn more about how the narratives that we tell about ourselves have really serious connections to the behaviors that we engage in. And narrative and storytelling is almost intrinsic to our sitting around campfires when we were but mere hunter-gatherers, and developing our linguistic capacities by touching each other in the soul. And one of the things that we really look at, finally, in conclusion, is like the concept of the shamans. When you look at the way shamans used to deal situations, they would consider trauma the cornerstone of any physical ailment, anything. And this is what we're learning in trauma treatment: the body keeps the score. And their idea was that the soul had separated itself from the body and was fractured. And by telling stories, they could bring the soul back into the self and reactivate a connection between mind, soul, and body. And when you compare that basic construct alongside of other religions, it makes it possible to frame narratives in a way where you're addressing evidence-based practices and the power of meaning making, storytelling, and other work like this is going on around the world and coming to the same conclusions. And so this is the deeper part of having advances in like neuroscience and technology. We can see the impact of these types of narratives on individuals and how they live their lives and engage in behaviors. I think that's a route that we really need to explore. We structure our programming around concept of promoting democratic, a global democratic identity, that the nation state identity is not enough anymore in a world where we're all interconnected. And then that creative pacifism, a commitment to nonviolence and creativity in the arts, has been the only means to affecting sustainable social change. And so that's what we're all about. You know, art therapy combined with narrative therapy, combined with getting people to tell their own stories, and in telling their own stories to restructure their memories so that everything that they've been through that might be traumatizing can become an asset and a means of empowerment.
I would also add as well, Jesse, that what I love about what Parallel Networks does is that when you have a person who was in a radical organization or an extremist in conversation with someone who may have been affected by something that they've done or something like someone like them has done, that creates a modeling. People need to see things happen to believe that they can actually be real. So people never see people of different walks of life or different ways of thinking come together in conversation. You think there's no place for it to come together. But if you see people do it, you will begin to believe it's real. And those are those mirror neurons in our brains that actually need to see people do things for us to believe them. All the things that we see that are hateful, we've seen people do them. That's why we know how to do them. We don't just know how to be hateful. We have to actually see it being modeled for us to really, imitate it. So that's the same for peace, or the same for tolerance. We're just trying to move people away from harming one another to maybe not all thinking the same thing, but just insist upon not hurting each other. Okay. Can we move away from that and just, move closer into this place where we can coexist with tolerance? But I think modeling it and just showing people that it can happen at all that goes a long way to making a person even begin to imitate that behavior, just like they imitated the hate that they learned, and the hate they internalized by the way people have treated them. And that's why trauma is so impactful, because you start to internalize what people have done to you. And instead of what happened to you, it becomes who you are. And so, getting people to tell their stories helps to have them separate from that internalization and helps to model for other people, what's possible. And that's what I think the conversations that Parallel Networks hosts and the panels that we'll be able to do in the future, bringing people who people think don't know how to communicate together, is going to do a lot of good just by existing in the world.
To that point, Hope, I think you really address the us versus them narrative, because when you create that forum for conversation, it's really a jolt to the system. If I say to somebody, I'm, meeting somebody at a hotel who used to pledge allegiance to ISIS or used to be a violent white supremacist, or, it's definitely a jolt to easy thinking. And because this is hard work, right? Getting the people in the room. But if you can get them in the room, the opportunities are really endless. And I'm so grateful to be with each of you, because each interaction that I have with fellow survivors, victims, or formers, it normalizes things in the right way.
Yeah.
It normalizes things to say, these conversations can happen, and it gives me optimism. And your name, the name that you bear, Hope, it gives me hope. So
absolutely, me too, absolutely.
I think we're at time almost. Darrell, can you take us out with some words of wisdom?
Now, everybody has shared more words of wisdom than I have, and I'm just absorbing it all. But, I think that we all have to be optimistic, because without hope, why are we doing this? If we did not believe that things could change. We all learned as kids that a tiger does not change its stripes, a leopard does not change its spots. So with that in mind, why would I or anybody think that a Klansman would change his robe and hood, a white supremacist would change his ideology? And when I got into this, I never expected anybody to change. That wasn't my mission at all. My mission was to find out, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? I mean, that's all I want to know. But then people began changing, and I was shocked, because I had that mindset: a tiger does not change its stripes, a leopard does not change its spots. And then I came to realize, yes, a leopard cannot change its stripes or spots, and a tiger cannot change its stripes, because they were born with those stripes and spots. But a white supremacist is not born with that ideology. A Klansman is not born with that robe and hood. That is a learned behavior. And what is learned can be unlearned. So that's why I have hope. And I want everybody going forward to have that hope, knowing that we can affect change in people, whether we do it as a group or whether we do it as individuals. Hope can occur if we're willing to put in the work. And that's what I've been doing for 37 years. Ryan, Hope, Michael there, Jesse, all of us, can have achieved these things and can inspire others to do that. And I'm hoping that we start this at a young age in the future, teaching kids in school to learn these things. So that way we're paying it forward. We're doing a preventive maintenance in the long run, so that we don't have to deal with it reactively.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just want to say that I just first want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts. And I also just want to thank the audience. All of you, I know, are interested and invested in this field, and I hope that we were able to supply for you today some interesting ideas and on intervention frameworks, and just personally, just the wisdom I think this group embodies. I hope that it helps you on your journeys. Jesse, did you have any final thoughts? Okay, well, hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Alliance for Peacebuilding. God bless.
Thank you.